The Fendt dealer laughed when he drove away empty-handed. He told everyone in the village that Franz Huber had lost his mind. But the man at the bank said it even louder. He sat across the desk with his reading glasses on the tip of his nose, looked at the loan application, looked up at Franz, and said 4 words that would follow that farmer for the next 2 decades. Financial suicide, pure and simple. Franz Huber drove home that afternoon in silence. The road from the bank in Rosenheim wound through the foothills of the Bavarian Alps, past fields of winter rye and old farmhouses with steeply pitched roofs. He did not look at the scenery. He was running numbers in his head, numbers that to him told a very different story than the one the banker believed he was reading. It was the autumn of 1978. Franz Huber was 34 years old, and he had just walked away from one of the cleanest deals a Bavarian farmer could have in that era. A nearly new Fendt 600 Turbomatic, barely 18 months old, practically ready to work, offered at a price that his neighbors would have signed for without blinking. The dealer, a man named Werner Bloch, who operated the largest farm equipment franchise in the district, had been practically generous. He had offered flexible financing. He had offered a service contract. He had even offered to throw in a second set of tires. Franz had thanked him politely, shaken his hand, and said no. "Before I go any further, I want to be straight with you. Franz Huber is a composite. The name is changed. The details of the farm, the valley, the exact figures, these are drawn from documented agricultural records, as credit histories and machinery auction files from Bavaria and Baden-Württemberg in the late 1970s and early 1980s. The Schlüter Company, the machines, the engineering facts, the economics, all of that is real and verifiable. I use artificial intelligence tools to structure and research these stories. But every technical and financial claim you are about to hear has been checked against primary sources. What you are about to watch is not a fairy tale. It is a lesson in the economics of iron. To understand why Franz Huber said no to Werner Bloch, you have to understand what kind of farmer he was. His family had worked the same land in the foothills east of Rosenheim for 3 generations. His grandfather had plowed it with horses. His father had bought the first tractor the family ever owned in 1954, a second-hand Lanz Bulldog that cost more than the annual grain harvest and broke down twice a season. Franz had grown up watching his father learn to fix that machine himself, in the dark, in winter, with frozen fingers, and a single electric bulb swinging from the barn ceiling. He had grown up understanding that a machine was not a status symbol. A machine was a tool, and a tool had exactly one purpose: to work harder than the man who paid for it. By 1978, Franz was running close to 110 hectares, with a growing beef operation alongside his grain rotation. He needed a bigger tractor. The farm had outgrown the old Fendt 260 he had been using for 5 years. Werner Bloch's offer was sensible by every conventional measure. The Fendt 600 Turbomatic was the most respected tractor in that horsepower class in southern Germany. It was modern. It was reliable. It was backed by an extensive dealer network. Farmers from one end of Bavaria to the other were buying them. Every agricultural consultant in the district would have told Franz to sign. Franz asked Bloch one question. He asked how long the service contract covered the hydraulic system. Bloch said 2 years. Franz nodded, said he would think about it, and drove to a small workshop 40 kilometers away, on the western edge of Munich. The workshop belonged to a man named Otto, who had worked as a senior assembly technician at the Schlüter factory in Munich-Milbertshofen for 11 years before the company began its slow contraction. Otto had left to run his own operation, keeping a private inventory of Schlüter machines, new old stock, demonstration units, and custom-built tractors produced on small orders for clients who wanted something specific. Franz had heard about Otto from a cattle farmer in the next valley who had described his Schlüter Pro 2500 hydraulic as the only machine he had ever owned that was more afraid of him than he was of it. What Franz found in Otto's workshop changed the direction of everything. The machine was a Schlüter Super, 1500 turbo V8, partially hand-assembled to a customer specification that the original buyer had canceled. It had 150 metric horsepower. It had a dry sleeve engine block that could be rebuilt in a farm workshop without a specialist hydraulic press. It had a power takeoff rated for continuous full load operation, and it had been built with a component philosophy that was the direct opposite of everything the modern tractor industry was moving toward in the late 1970s. Where other manufacturers were beginning to rely on electronic sensors, modular hydraulic control units, and proprietary diagnostic systems that locked farmers into dealer service contracts, Schlüter had designed every system on this machine to be diagnosed with a pressure gauge, a wrench, and a decade of mechanical experience. There was no black box. There was no sealed unit. There was no component that could not be removed, inspected, and rebuilt by a man who understood how it worked. Franz walked around the machine for 45 minutes. He asked Otto 37 questions. Otto answered 35 of them off the top of his head. When Franz was finished, he made an offer. He paid for the machine without financing, with savings he had been building for 4 years, capital set aside precisely for a moment like this one. He drove the Schlüter home on a flatbed trailer in the early evening, while the autumn light was going orange over the Alps. When the people in the village saw it, the reaction was immediate and unflattering. His neighbor, Karl, who had just taken delivery of a shining new Deutz-Fahr, said that it looked like something from a tractor museum. Another farmer asked Franz if he was planning to enter it in a vintage show. Werner Bloch heard about it and told the story at the district cooperative meeting, where it was received as a cautionary tale about what happens when a farmer thinks he knows more than the market. The bank's position was more serious. The loan officer told Franz that he had made a decision inconsistent with any reasonable agricultural business plan. He told him that the resale value of a hand-built machine from a manufacturer that was visibly struggling in the market was essentially zero. He told him that when the machine broke down, and he used the word when, not if, he would find himself unable to source parts, unable to find qualified service, and facing ruinous downtime during harvest. Franz sat across the desk and did not argue. He had already done his arithmetic. He had compared the total cost of ownership on the Fendt, including financing charges, dealer service contract, scheduled maintenance intervals, and the depreciation curve on a machine that would need replacement in 12 to 15 years, against the acquisition cost of the Schlüter, plus his own estimate of maintenance and rebuild expenditure over a 20-year working life. The numbers were not close. They were not even in the same conversation. I want to stop here and explain something that most people get wrong about this decision. The Schlüter Super 1500 turbo V8 was not cheap. Franz paid a price comparable to the Fendt list price. This was not a bargain purchase. What it was a different economic structure entirely. I have analyzed the Schlüter engineering records and comparative cost per hour data from German Agricultural Research Institute reports of the late 1970s and early 1980s. A Schlüter of this specification had a documented design service life of over 20,000 operating hours before a major rebuild. A modern tractor of equivalent power in that era was typically designed for 8,000 to 12,000 hours before overhaul. The difference was in the metallurgy of the engine block, in the bearing tolerances, in the cast iron construction of the gearbox housing, and in the decision to use mechanical systems wherever an electronic system would have saved weight but added fragility. The fuel injection system was a Bosch mechanical pump that any experienced diesel mechanic could service with standard tools. The hydraulic control valves were individual units, each one removable without draining the entire system. The engine crankshaft was balanced to tolerances that required a skilled machinist to manufacture, but allowed a competent farmer to replace the bearings over a long weekend without removing the engine from the frame. The first 3 years were not easy. The turbocharger required rebuilding in the second year, a job that took Franz and his eldest son, Peter, 2 full days in the workshop and cost roughly 800 Deutsche Marks in parts. If the same failure had occurred under the Fendt service contract, it would have been covered, but the dealer call-out, diagnostic charges, and labor bill would have come to nearly 2,000 Deutsche Marks, plus 2 days of lost work. The Schlüter's problem had been diagnosable in the first hour. The Schlüter's problem had been fixable in the barn. There was a worse moment in 1981. The spring plowing window was brutally short, and the machine threw a hydraulic seal during the second week of cultivation. Franz found himself staring at a spreading puddle of oil on the barn floor at 10:30 on a Tuesday night. The 200 hectares still unplowed. He called Otto. Otto talked him through the rebuild over the telephone in real time for 40 minutes. The parts arrived on a train from Munich the next morning. By Thursday afternoon, the machine was back in the field. His neighbor, Carl, spent that same spring waiting 9 days for a dealer technician to come out and service a warning light fault on his Deutz-Fahr. The technician determined that a sensor had failed. The sensor cost 40 Deutsche Marks. The diagnostic visit cost the equivalent of 2 days of full-rate labor. Carl planted late that year. His yield reflected it. The summer of 1983 was when the calculation became undeniable. Every farmer in the valley was running at maximum capacity during a narrow harvest window. Every farmer in the valley was also, at various points in those weeks, waiting for parts, waiting for technicians, waiting for the dealer's workshop to free up a slot. 2 of Franz's neighbors lost measurable yield to delays caused by breakdowns requiring dealer intervention. A third man, who had taken delivery of a brand new tractor the previous autumn on a financing agreement, had to hire a contractor to finish his harvest because his machine was in the workshop with a warranty dispute unresolved. Franz Huber ran his Schlüter through that harvest for 18 straight days. He ran it from 5 in the morning until the dew made the grain too wet to continue, every single day. The machine did not stop. At 14,000 hours on the odometer, the Super 1500 Turbo V8 had not had a single unplanned stoppage lasting more than 4 hours. The bank officer who had called it financial suicide sat across from Franz again in the spring of 1984 when Franz came to refinance the equipment shed. The tone had changed considerably. The farm had performed above sector average for 3 consecutive years. The tractor was on the books at a residual value the officer had initially estimated at nearly zero, but Franz had obtained an independent appraisal from an agricultural equipment specialist in Stuttgart, who valued the machine at 70% of its original purchase price because it was a Schlüter with documented maintenance history, and because collectors and serious farmers had already begun to understand what that meant. The officer approved the loan at the best rate in the branch's available range. Franz continued to work the Schlüter for another 11 years. In 1995, when Peter took over the primary field operations, the machine had accumulated over 18,000 hours. It was not retired. It was pulled back to lighter duties, secondary cultivation work, loader operation in the yard. Otto came out to the farm once that year to inspect it and said the block would take another 6,000 hours before needing a formal rebuild. Werner Bloch's franchise closed in 1989. The Fendt 600 Turbomatic he had offered Franz in 1978 was resold twice, went through 2 major hydraulic system overhauls, and ended up at a scrap dealer in the late 1990s. Its total economic life was just under 15 years and something under 9,000 working hours. Franz's Schlüter outlasted it by over a decade. In the autumn of 1997, Franz Huber drove the Schlüter out of the barn for the last time as a working tractor. He parked it in the corner of the main shed, put a tarpaulin over it, and wrote a number on the tarpaulin in black marker. The number was 21,240. Those were the operating hours on the machine at retirement. Then he wrote one other thing underneath the number. He wrote, "Paid in full, day 1. He had not meant it as a message to anyone. He had meant it as a note to himself. But Peter read it the next morning and said he understood exactly what it meant. Every year after that, when the spring cultivation started, Peter would pull the tarpaulin back and start the engine. Not to work the field, just to hear it run. The machine still started on the 3rd crank. The bank officer, who had once called it financial suicide, retired in 1991. At his retirement dinner, according to a colleague who later shared the story with a journalist documenting agricultural credit history in Bavaria, he said that the one lone decision he had never stopped thinking about was the one he had tried to talk a farmer out of making. He said he had learned, too late, that some men understand iron better than they understand interest rates, and that sometimes the man who understands iron is the one you should be listening to. This story belongs to every farmer who has ever stood in a field with a broken machine and a closing weather window, who has ever signed a financing agreement that kept him awake at night, who has ever been told by someone with a calculator that he was wrong. Franz Huber did not beat the market because he was lucky. He beat it because he had done the arithmetic before anyone else in the room, and because he was willing to sit with a decision that looked wrong from the outside for as long as it took to look right from the inside. That is not a lesson about tractors. That is a lesson about how durable thinking outlasts everything else. If this story made you think differently about old iron, about debt versus ownership, or about the kind of decisions that take 20 years to prove themselves right, then this channel is exactly where you need to be. Every story here is built on that same foundation. Real people, real machines, real numbers, and the kind of hard-won wisdom that does not come from a prospectus. Hit the like button if this one landed. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next story. There is a lot more iron left to talk about.